Jake Harrison had always considered his cabin by the lake to be his sanctuary. After years of high-stakes work in the city as part of a tactical response unit, the cabin was where he found peace, nestled among tall pines with the sound of water, lapping against the shore and birds calling in the distance. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he often faced at work. It was here, away from sirens and city streets, that Jake could finally breathe. This year, the cabin carried an even deeper meaning. Jake and his team were about to celebrate 10 years of working together, a decade filled with trust, loyalty, and experiences only those in their line of work could fully understand. For them, this anniversary was not just a milestone. It was a symbol of survival, unity, and the unbreakable bond they had forged. Jake wanted the celebration to reflect that, so he planned a weekend BBQ by the lake, inviting his squad and their families for food, laughter, and relaxation. Yet even as Jake arranged coolers of drinks and stacked firewood for the evening, he knew one thing might cast a shadow over the gathering: the local homeowners association. The HOA was infamous for meddling in matters that did not concern them, and the president, Linda Dawson, had a reputation for being relentless. She thrived on control, ensuring that even minor details like mailbox paint and lawn height fell under her authority. To her, order and compliance were personal victories. Jake, however, had done his homework. His cabin technically sat just outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Legally, they had no say over his property or what he did there. He had checked the maps, read the bylaws, and even confirmed it with the county office. But Linda did not see boundaries the same way. If she thought she could control it, she would try. As Jake unloaded supplies onto the wooden deck overlooking the lake, his neighbor, Carl, wandered over. Carl had lived nearby for years and had often warned Jake about Linda's persistence. "She's not going to like this party," Carl said with a chuckle, nodding at the tables Jake had set up. "She gets jumpy about more than 4 cars in a driveway. A full BBQ? That'll send her into orbit." Jake laughed, brushing off the concern. "She can get as jumpy as she wants. This place isn't under her rule book." Carl grinned, but lowered his voice. "Don't underestimate her. She finds ways. Just keep an eye out." Jake nodded politely, though he wasn't worried. After years in law enforcement, he had dealt with far tougher situations than a persistent HOA president. Still, the warning lingered in the back of his mind as he continued preparing for the weekend. By late afternoon, the first of his teammates arrived. Trucks pulled into the gravel driveway, doors opened, and the sound of cheerful greetings filled the air. His teammates brought their families, spouses, children, and even a few dogs who bounded toward the water with joy. The scene was heartwarming, and Jake felt a wave of pride as he watched the group gather. Grills were set up, music played softly from a portable speaker, and the smell of marinated meat soon drifted through the trees. The kids ran along the shoreline, skipping stones and chasing each other while the adults settled into lawn chairs, laughing and sharing stories. It was exactly the kind of celebration Jake had hoped for. A reminder that life wasn't only about duty, but also about the moments in between. Still, as the evening sun dipped low, Jake couldn't help but notice a car creeping past the cabin. It was a silver sedan, polished to perfection, moving slower than necessary. Behind the wheel was Linda Dawson. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared at the gathering before disappearing around the bend. Jake shook his head and turned back to his guests. He wasn't going to let her ruin this, but deep down he knew that look in her eyes. Linda wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This weekend, the cabin would host more than just a party. It would become the stage for a confrontation no one expected. The night after the first arrivals, Jake slept lightly. Years of tactical work had conditioned him to notice small details, and though the cabin was quiet, he still woke at the faint sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. He peered through the window but saw nothing out of place, only the faint moonlight glimmering on the lake. By morning, he dismissed it as one of the late guests leaving their car door shut too firmly. What Jake didn't know was that Linda Dawson had already begun setting her plan into motion. After driving past the night before, she had called an emergency meeting with 2 HOA board members who shared her desire for strict control. They met in her dining room sipping tea beneath a chandelier that swung slightly whenever a car passed outside. "He's throwing a massive party," Linda said firmly, tapping the edge of her notebook. "Music, cars, grills. This will set a bad example for the entire community. If we don't stop it now, others will follow." "But the cabin isn't under HOA management," one of the board members reminded her. Linda narrowed her eyes. "Technicalities. If it affects our streets, our peace, or our safety, then it's within our reach. And believe me, this gathering does all three." The second board member hesitated. "So, what do you suggest? A fine?" Linda leaned back, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Something stronger. Something that reminds him we enforce order around here. If he wants to play stubborn, we'll make him regret it." Her plan was bold and reckless. She had contacts, friends of friends, who could provide uniforms, badges, and the appearance of authority without the actual weight of it. To most neighbors, that would be more than enough to intimidate them into shutting down a gathering. She convinced herself that Jake would be no different. Back at the cabin, Jake's teammates continued to arrive throughout the morning. By noon, the lawn was alive with chatter and movement. Folding tables sagged under the weight of food, burgers, ribs, potato salad, and desserts. Coolers brimmed with ice and drinks, and the scent of charcoal carried on the breeze. The men and women of his team laughed together, their bond evident to anyone watching. They weren't simply colleagues. They were family forged in high-pressure moments most people could never imagine. Their spouses mingled easily, sharing stories of late-night call-outs, sudden schedule changes, and the pride they carried for their loved ones. Jake watched it all with quiet satisfaction. Every detail had come together perfectly. He thought back to Carl's warning and smiled to himself. The cabin wasn't under HOA rules, and he had no reason to fear Linda's interference. This was their space, their time. But as the afternoon went on, Jake noticed the same silver sedan pass by again. Linda's face was expressionless, her gaze fixed on the lawn full of people. A second later, the car was gone. He mentioned it casually to one of his teammates, Officer Martinez, who frowned. "Something about her doesn't sit right," Martinez said, sipping from his bottle of water. "You're sure she can't interfere?" "She doesn't have authority here," Jake replied. "But she doesn't like hearing no. That's her real problem." Martinez chuckled. "Well, good thing we're used to problems." That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the air filled with the sound of laughter and music, Linda made her final call. She arranged for 3 men to arrive the following afternoon, dressed convincingly in police uniforms, ready to shut down Jake's party. In her mind, it was the perfect plan. No one would dare defy what looked like law enforcement. She failed to consider one crucial fact. This wasn't just any weekend gathering. This was a tactical team's anniversary party. Each guest was trained to notice details, question inconsistencies, and handle unexpected confrontations. The following day would not unfold the way Linda expected. Instead of fear, her plan would spark something else entirely, a moment that would leave her reputation in tatters. For now, though, the cabin glowed with lantern light, the sound of clinking glasses, and the warmth of a team celebrating their shared bond. Jake sat back in his chair, unaware that the quiet joy of this evening was the calm before Linda's storm. The morning sun broke over the tree line, casting golden light across the lake. The cabin's yard looked like a picture of summer contentment, tables stacked with leftovers from the night before, chairs pulled into clusters, and the faint smell of smoke still drifting from the fire pit. Jake woke early as he always did and stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand. The air was cool, quiet, and calm, as if the world itself had chosen to rest after the night's celebration. By mid-morning, the team began stirring again. Some gathered near the grill to reheat food, while others tossed a football across the lawn. Kids ran along the dock, laughing and splashing water at each other. The mood was relaxed, unhurried, everything a team gathering should be. But while Jake's group enjoyed the peace, a different kind of preparation was happening just a mile away. 3 men dressed in crisp uniforms leaned against a nondescript van. Their badges gleamed in the sunlight, polished but not official. Their radios crackled faintly, more for show than actual use. They weren't real officers, though Linda Dawson had convinced herself that appearances were enough to do the job. Linda arrived moments later, stepping out of her sedan with a clipboard in hand. "You know what to do," she told them, her voice low but sharp. "Go in, act authoritative, and shut it down. He'll fold once he sees the uniforms. Trust me." The men nodded. They weren't eager, but the money Linda had offered was enough incentive to play their part. They straightened their belts, adjusted their hats, and climbed back into the van. Linda watched as it rolled down the narrow road toward Jake's cabin, her lips tightening into a self-satisfied smile. At the cabin, Jake and Officer Martinez were hauling firewood toward the pit when they spotted the van pulling up. Martinez squinted. "You expecting anyone else?" "No," Jake said flatly. He set the logs down, his eyes narrowing as 3 uniformed men stepped out. Something about their stride was off, too casual, too practiced without the edge of real service. He felt his instincts sharpen. The men spread out across the driveway, one of them lifting a hand in a gesture meant to stop the gathering. "This event needs to shut down immediately," the man in front declared. His voice carried authority, but his badge caught the light at an odd angle, and Jake noticed the emblem wasn't from any department he recognized. The yard fell quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Kids ran back to their parents, who instinctively pulled them close. Members of Jake's team exchanged glances, their training kicking in without a word. Jake walked forward slowly, coffee mug still in hand. "And you are?" he asked evenly. "Officers," the man replied, lifting his chin. "This gathering is in violation of local regulations. Pack it up." Martinez stepped closer, his tone calm but probing. "Which department are you with?" "County Enforcement," the man said, a little too quickly. Another team member, Officer Daniels, muttered under his breath. "There's no such division." Jake's eyes flicked over every detail, the mismatched stitching on the uniforms, the generic belts, the absence of proper name tags. He knew immediately these weren't officers. They were imposters. But instead of calling them out directly, he kept his expression unreadable. "I see," Jake said. "Well, if this isn't a official order, I'm sure you won't mind providing identification. Standard procedure, right?" The man's jaw tightened. Behind him, the other 2 shifted uncomfortably. From the lawn, the rest of the SWAT team watched in silence. Their children looked on curiously, unaware of the tension rising like heat off the pavement. Jake set his coffee down on the hood of his truck and took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "Let's make this simple. Show us your ID or I'll need to make a call. You understand how that works?" The lead imposter hesitated. A bead of sweat traced down his temple. He hadn't expected questions, just obedience. In that moment, Linda's carefully crafted plan began to wobble. The uniforms, the tone, the appearance of authority. None of it worked on people who spent their lives recognizing the real thing. The yard remained silent, but beneath the calm, an unmistakable shift had taken place. Jake's team wasn't intimidated. They were assessing, waiting, ready to act. And the 3 men in fake uniforms were quickly realizing they had walked into the worst possible crowd to bluff. The first cracks had appeared, and the standoff was only beginning. The imposters stood frozen under the weight of Jake's gaze. What was supposed to be a quick intimidation routine now felt like a spotlight had been turned back on them. The silence stretched, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the dock. Jake took another slow step forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. You came onto private property dressed as law enforcement. That means you can either show me your identification right now, or we'll assume something worse is happening. Which do you prefer? One of the men shifted nervously, glancing at his partner. The second man muttered something under his breath, too low for the crowd to hear, but Jake caught the tone. Uncertainty. These weren't professionals. They were hired pretenders, and the act was unraveling quickly. Martinez, arms crossed, added just enough pressure. If you're with county enforcement, then you know the sheriff's office would have been looped in. Funny, I don't recall seeing any briefing. Care to explain that? The imposters said nothing. Their silence was an answer all its own. Behind Jake, his team had begun to stir. Officer Daniels, broad-shouldered and imposing, stood up from his seat and walked over, pulling his badge casually from his pocket. Since we're swapping credentials, he said, holding it up to the sunlight, here's mine. SWAT Division, county certified. Want me to call the station and verify yours? The lead imposter's face lost its color. Murmurs spread across the yard. The spouses of Jake's teammates whispered to one another. Children tugged on sleeves, sensing the tension but not fully understanding. Neighbors who had wandered over to join the party earlier that morning now watched with wide eyes. Jake turned his head slightly, speaking just loud enough for the imposters to hear. This is where you realize the mistake you've made. You didn't walk into a backyard cookout. You walked into a gathering of law enforcement. The effect was immediate. One of the fake officers actually took a step back, his boots scraping against the gravel. The man with the clipboard, clearly the supposed leader, tried to salvage the situation, raising his chin. We don't need to justify ourselves to you. This event is illegal. That's final. Jake almost smiled. The performance had cracked, and now desperation was showing. Illegal? Jake repeated. His tone was steady, but there was an edge of dry humor in it. Having a barbecue on my own property with invited guests? Tell me, which code is that under? Because my guess is you. Can't name one, the man faltered. His eyes flicked toward the trees as if hoping Linda Dawson would appear to bail him out. But Linda was keeping her distance, watching from her car down the road, unaware her plan was collapsing in real time. Officer Daniels stepped closer, his voice low but firm. You have two options. Produce legitimate credentials right now, or we treat this as impersonation of an officer. And trust me, that charge doesn't go away quietly. The imposters exchanged panicked looks. One whispered, "We should go," while another tried to hold his ground, but his trembling hand gave him away. Jake leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure his words cut through. If you think walking away will save you, think again. Cameras are rolling. He gestured casually toward the corner of the cabin where a small security system blinked red. It wasn't a bluff. Jake had upgraded the cameras last year after a string of petty break-ins, and now those recordings would capture every moment of this exchange. The imposters froze again, realizing they'd been boxed in. Leave, and they'd be caught fleeing. The scene. Stay, and they'd be forced to admit they weren't who they claimed to be. Jake let the silence hang, the weight of inevitability pressing down on them. Then he turned to Martinez, his voice smooth but loud enough for everyone to hear. Why don't you go ahead and call dispatch? Let them know we have 3 men impersonating officers on private property. Should be a priority pickup. The color drained from the lead imposter's face. Wait, he stammered. That's not necessary. We'll just leave. But Jake shook his head slowly. No. You came here to intimidate my family and my friends. That's not something you get to walk away from without consequences. The imposters looked around, realizing the crowd had circled in closer. Every escape route felt blocked. weren't in control anymore. The entire situation had flipped. For the first time since arriving, the SWAT team allowed a trace of their real presence to show. Shoulders squared, eyes sharp, they looked less like party guests and more like the trained officers they were. The imposters could feel it, and the weight was suffocating. The tables had turned. What began as an attempt to shut down a harmless BBQ was about to expose the HOA's most dangerous scheme yet. The backyard had gone from festive laughter to tense silence in the span of minutes. The fake officers, once posturing with false authority, now looked more like trapped actors caught in the wrong play. Jake stood firm, his presence steady, while his team subtly closed ranks around the imposters. Martinez spoke into his phone, his tone calm but deliberate. "Dispatch, this is Martinez. We've got 3 individuals impersonating law enforcement at a private gathering. Location is the Ridgeview cabin property. Need confirmation and units en route." Every word carried, and the imposters flinched, as if struck. They knew their performance was over. Jake didn't let the silence linger. He took another step closer, his voice lowering, but his words carried to every corner of the yard. "You didn't come here by accident. Someone sent you, and I'd bet my career it wasn't the county sheriff." The clipboard man's lips parted, but no sound came. He glanced toward the road again as though hoping for rescue. Jake followed his gaze, and sure enough, a car sat parked just beyond the trees. The sleek black sedan was instantly familiar. He'd seen it before. Linda, Dawson's pride and joy, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, and the very person who'd threatened him about holding the barbecue. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Martinez was the first to say it aloud. "She's here." The imposters' faces drained of color. One muttered, "She said this would be simple." Jake's expression hardened. That was all the confirmation he needed. He turned toward his team, voice even. "So the HOA thought it was a good idea to hire actors to play police. That's not just harassment. That's fraud, intimidation, and impersonation." The neighbors who had been watching from the sidelines began whispering among themselves, shock etched across their faces. Some had been skeptical of Jake's complaints about Linda's overreach, but now, with the evidence standing right in front of them, there was no denying it. Jake raised his voice, projecting outward. "This is what happens when power is abused. An HOA board that can't control a barbecue on private land resorts to lies and intimidation, and they thought they could get away with it." The murmurs grew louder. A few neighbors pulled out their phones, recording the imposters and Linda's car sitting conspicuously in the distance. The imposters, cornered, began to plead. "We didn't know. She just told us it was a role-playing job, nothing serious." Jake didn't flinch. "That's no excuse. You put on badges you didn't earn and tried to shut down a family gathering. You don't walk away from that." Martinez, still on the phone, confirmed that sheriff's deputies were en route. 5 minutes out," he reported calmly. Linda must have realized the trap was closing because her car door suddenly opened. She stepped out, her usual polished composure faltering under the collective stares of the crowd. She straightened her blazer as if the crisp lines could somehow shield her from the disaster unfolding. Jake met her eyes across the yard. "You picked the wrong night, Linda." She tried to muster authority, her voice sharp. "This event violates community rules. The noise, the number of vehicles, none of this was approved." But her words no longer carried the same sting. The neighbors weren't nodding in agreement this time. Instead, phones kept recording, and skeptical expressions met her attempt at control. Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Community rules don't override the law, and the law doesn't look kindly on impersonation. A low rumble of agreement came from the crowd. The tide had shifted. For the first time, Linda wasn't dictating the narrative. She was losing it. The sound of sirens in the distance sealed her fate. Red and blue lights flickered faintly through the trees as the sheriff's deputies made their way up the long gravel road. The imposters exchanged desperate looks, realizing escape was no longer possible. Linda's face tightened, and for the first time, she looked less like a leader and more like a cornered neighbor who had gone too far. Jake turned to his team, his words measured but firm. Tonight was supposed to be about celebration. Instead, we just exposed how far the HOA will go to control people. Let's make sure the truth is documented. Phones captured everything. The imposters trembling, Linda standing stiff by her car, the SWAT officers calmly explaining the situation. The barbecue that began as a simple gathering had transformed into a defining moment for the entire neighborhood. The time the deputies arrived, it was no longer a question of whether Linda had overstepped. It was a matter of how severe the consequences would be, and as the flashing lights illuminated the yard, Jake knew one thing for certain. The HOA's grip on the community had been broken. The rumble of tires on gravel silenced the last of the murmurs. Everyone turned as two sheriff's cruisers rounded the bend, their headlights cutting through the dusk. Red and blue strobes splashed against the trees, a stark reminder that the game of pretend had ended. The imposters froze where they stood, stiff and pale. Linda, still by her car, folded her arms tightly as if bracing for impact. Jake exhaled slowly, not with relief, but with certainty. He knew the arrival of real law enforcement meant accountability was no longer optional. The first deputy stepped out, a tall figure with a calm but commanding presence. His badge gleamed under the lights. "Evening, folks. We got a call about individuals impersonating officers. Who's in charge here?" Jake stepped forward without hesitation. "Jake Carson, property owner. These three showed up claiming to be law enforcement and tried to shut down a lawful barbecue. They were sent by the HOA president." He angled his head toward Linda, who stiffened but said nothing. The deputy's eyes narrowed as he scanned the imposters. "Badges?" he asked curtly. The clipboard man fumbled with his pocket, pulling out a cheap tin emblem that looked like it belonged in a costume shop. The other two followed suit, offering similarly fake trinkets. The deputy didn't need to touch them to know they were counterfeit. The second deputy moved closer, expression unreadable. "You three are being detained for impersonating officers. Don't move." He pulled zip ties from his belt while the crowd collectively inhaled. One imposter stammered, "We didn't mean any harm. She told us it was just a job. Just acting." He pointed directly at Linda. Phones lifted higher as neighbors captured every word. Linda snapped, "That's a lie. I don't know these people." But the timing was all wrong. Her denial only made the whispers louder. Jake folded his arms, steady as stone. "Funny, because that's your car, and they already said you promised it would be simple." The first deputy shifted his focus to Linda. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step over here." Her composure cracked. "This is ridiculous. I am the president of this association. I was ensuring community rules were followed." The deputy's voice stayed calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Community rules don't authorize you to hire people to impersonate law enforcement. That's a criminal matter." The crowd's whispers turned into open conversation. Some neighbors shook their heads. Others muttered about finally seeing Linda's true colors. A few even laughed quietly, unable to hold back at the sheer absurdity of it all. Jake's team stood in quiet solidarity, arms crossed, their presence reinforcing the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just an embarrassing slip, it was a full exposure of corruption. Martinez leaned toward Jake, voice low. "She's finished." Jake nodded slightly. "She just doesn't realize it yet." The deputies secured the imposters with zip ties and guided them toward the cruisers. The three men looked deflated, their bravado completely gone. Linda, however, wasn't ready to surrender her control. "This is harassment," she insisted. "You're making a mistake. These men..." We're only trying to keep order in the community." The deputy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The mistake was thinking you could play police. "We'll be speaking with you downtown." A stunned silence swept over the crowd as the words settled. Jake glanced around and saw the shift in his neighbor's expressions. They weren't just shocked. They were relieved. For years, Linda's iron grip on the HOA had gone unchecked. Now, in real time, they were witnessing the collapse of that authority. A neighbor in the back called out, "About time someone stood up to her." Another chimed in, "She's been pushing too far for years." The deputies moved Linda toward the cruiser, reading her rights as the phones continued recording. Her protests grew quieter, drowned out by the hum of conversation and the occasional clap from onlookers. Jake didn't smile, but a weight lifted from his shoulders. The fight wasn't fully over. There would still be hearings, paperwork, fallout. But this was the turning point. The narrative had shifted. As the deputies closed the cruiser door behind Linda, Jake finally addressed the crowd. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating. Instead, it turned into proof. Proof that when people abuse power, it eventually catches up to them. The words struck home. His neighbors nodded, many of them finally seeing Jake not as a troublemaker, but as someone willing to stand firm when it mattered most. The cruisers pulled away slowly, carrying Linda and her hired imposters down the road. The flashing lights faded into the night, leaving the cabin yard illuminated once more by string lights and the warm glow of the fire pit. Martinez clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Now, can we finally get back to eating? I didn't come here to babysit wannabe cops." Laughter rippled through the group, the tension breaking at last. Plates were refilled, drinks were poured, and conversation buzzed again. But beneath the return of normalcy, one truth lingered. The HOA had been exposed, and nothing in the neighborhood would ever be the same again. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like a hive after being shaken. The sight of Linda being escorted into a sheriff's cruiser had spread faster than wildfire. Every phone clip, every whispered retelling seemed to magnify her downfall. Jake didn't need to check social media to know the story had left the cabin yard. As he walked down the gravel lane to grab his mail, he caught the wary glances and hushed conversations of neighbors. Some nodded in approval. Others looked unsettled, as though realizing the HOA's shield had finally cracked. At the center of the gossip, one truth stood tall. Linda, the once untouchable HOA president, had crossed a line she couldn't walk back from. That afternoon, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting at the community hall. Normally, such gatherings were staged affairs, Linda at the head, her allies nodding along, residents seated quietly at the back. But this time was different. Word had spread, and the hall overflowed. Folding chairs lined the walls. People stood. In the doorways, and for the first time in years, the board members looked nervous. Jake arrived with a calm stride. He didn't sit in the back this time. Instead, he stood near the front, arms crossed, a quiet reminder that he had nothing to hide. The vice president of the HOA, a wiry man named Gerald, cleared his throat at the podium. "We're here to address the events of last night," he began, but his voice wavered under the weight of so many watchful eyes. "The actions that took place do not reflect the values of this association." From the crowd, a neighbor spoke up. "Then why did your president send people dressed as cops to harass someone's barbecue?" Murmurs of agreement echoed. Gerald raised his hands for calm. "The matter is under investigation by local authorities. Until it's resolved, Linda has agreed to step aside temporarily." "Temporarily?" another voice barked. "She impersonated law enforcement. That's a crime, not a misunderstanding." The board squirmed. Without Linda's dominating presence, their usual rehearsed control dissolved. Jake finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying through the room. "For years, this board has allowed one person to abuse her power. Last night was just the first time she was caught in the open. The HOA exists to support homeowners, not intimidate them. We all deserve better than this. A wave of nods followed, louder and stronger than before. One board member, an older woman with silver hair, removed her glasses and sighed. Jake is right. I've stayed quiet too long, but this went too far. We need change. Her admission cracked the dam. Neighbors who had been silent out of fear now spoke openly. Stories spilled out. Fines for trivial things, threats of liens, manipulative letters. The record of Linda's reign became undeniable. Gerald fumbled with his notes, trying to redirect. Let's not rush into chaos. But the crowd had momentum now. We're not rushing, a man from the back shouted. We've been waiting years. We want a vote. The demand rolled through the room like thunder. Vote! Vote! The board exchanged panicked glances. They weren't prepared for revolt, but the voices left them little choice. Gerald finally relented. Fine. A motion to remove Linda as president and hold a special election. All in favor? Hands shot up. Nearly every neighbor raised theirs high, some with both hands. The sheer majority was overwhelming. Against? Gerald asked weakly. Only 2 hands lifted, both longtime allies of Linda, their faces pale under the scrutiny. The decision was clear. Applause erupted, loud and cathartic. Years of frustration poured into that sound. For once, the board didn't gavel it down. They let it echo because there was no stopping it. Jake didn't clap. He simply stood, watching the board lower their heads. Justice wasn't about noise. It was about resolution. Still, he felt the shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. The community had reclaimed its voice. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors approached Jake. Some shook his hand. Others thanked him quietly. One woman even smiled and said, "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us." Jake nodded, accepting the words without pride. All I did was refuse to back down. The rest came from everyone else. Back at his cabin, the fire pit was cold. The chairs still scattered from the night before. Yet the air felt different. Lighter somehow. The fight had scarred the community, but it had also peeled away years of silence. Martinez called that evening. "Heard you turned the neighborhood into a courtroom," he joked. Jake chuckled softly. "Didn't have to. They did it themselves. Sometimes all people need is a push." "And sometimes," Martinez replied, "they need a barbecue to remember who they are." Jake smiled at the thought. The party had been interrupted, but the outcome was bigger than any celebration. The HOA had been shaken to its core, and the community was finally awake. And though he wouldn't say it out loud, Jake knew one thing for certain. Linda's empire had fallen, and there was no rebuilding it. The days that followed Linda's removal as HOA president felt like a strange calm after a long, stubborn storm. For years, the neighborhood had lived under her watchful eye, her rules pressed down like iron weights. Now, those weights had been lifted, leaving people blinking in the sunlight of a freedom they hadn't realized they were missing. Jake noticed the difference almost immediately. Where once neighbors had avoided speaking in public, worried their words might get back to the board, they now lingered on porches and sidewalks. Conversations flowed easily. Children rode their bikes without anyone measuring tire marks in driveways. Even the smallest things, like seeing someone put up a wind chime or park a truck a little crooked, spoke volumes about the change. The cabin barbecue became a symbol in its own right. Whenever people brought it up, they didn't just mention the fake cops or Linda's downfall. They remembered the laughter, the food, the sense of togetherness that sparked in that yard before everything went sideways. The new board, now reorganized, without Linda's shadow, reached out to Jake within a week. They asked if he would join as an advisor, someone to help rebuild trust between the HOA and the residents. Jake politely declined. He had no interest in meetings and motions, but he told them plainly, If you're serious about serving the community instead of controlling it, you'll do fine. Just keep it fair." The board listened. They canceled unfair fines, dropped unnecessary restrictions, and invited homeowners to suggest changes. It wasn't perfect. No neighborhood ever was. But the cracks were starting to fill with something. Stronger than rules. Cooperation. Linda, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Rumor had it she'd hired a lawyer, hoping to downplay the charges against her. Others said she'd left town to stay with relatives until the heat died down. Either way, she no longer cast her long shadow over the neighborhood. People mentioned her name less and less, as if speaking it would summon back the past. For Jake, peace returned to his cabin. One evening he rebuilt the fire pit with sturdier stones, stacking them carefully until the ring looked solid enough for years of gatherings to come. His fellow SWAT officers stopped by often, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in casual clothes, always welcome. Together, they finished what that interrupted party had started. Celebrations that were theirs alone, free from intrusion. One night, as the flames flickered high and cast long shadows across the trees, Martinez leaned back in his chair and shook, his head with a grin. "You know, Jake, we've had training exercises that didn't end as dramatically as your barbecue." Jake smirked. "Guess it was just another kind of test." "What kind?" "To see how much nonsense a community can take before it finally pushes back." The fire popped, sparks shooting into the night like fireworks. Jake's words lingered with his friends, but he wasn't speaking just about the HOA anymore. He meant it as a lesson for anyone who had ever been silenced, pushed around, or made to feel small. The neighborhood had learned something too. The HOA wasn't invincible. The residents weren't powerless, and sometimes all it took was one person refusing to bend for everyone else to remember their own strength. By the end of the summer, the barbecue became an annual tradition, not just for Jake and his team, but for the neighborhood. Families came with coolers, kids splashed in the nearby creek, and people brought dishes to share. No one worried about permits or fines. Instead, they enjoyed what community was always meant to be. At the first of these new gatherings, Gerald, now humbled but still serving on the board, stood up with a paper plate in his hands and said, "Here's to fewer rules and better neighbors." The crowd cheered, and someone clinked a soda can against his in agreement. Jake watched from his chair, a plate balanced on his knees. He wasn't the center of the attention, and that suited him fine. He'd never wanted glory, just fairness. Seeing the neighbors laugh together was enough. As dusk fell and lanterns flickered to life, Jake felt a sense of closure. The battle with Linda and her schemes was over. In its place stood something stronger, something built by people finally willing to stand, shoulder to shoulder. The fire crackled, the voices rose in laughter, and the sound of music drifted into the cool night air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't divided by fear or rules. It was united by choice, by shared moments, and by the simple joy of being free. And at the heart of it all, Jake sat quietly, knowing he hadn't just defended a barbecue. He had helped light a spark that would keep burning long after the smoke from the fire pit faded into the stars.